From Lighthouse Reports, this is Backlight. Every month, we take you behind the scenes of real-world collaborative investigations.
We're your hosts, impact producer Tessa Pang
and investigative reporter Beatriz Ramalho de Silva.
Hey everyone, welcome back to Backlight. Beatriz and I are 2 days away from a big investigation, which will actually be published by the time you're listening to this.
Yes, so this big investigation is basically called Brain Waste, and we've been working on it for over a year. And right now we're kind of in the final stretches, which means it's a lot of stress, a lot of things to do, but we're really excited to get it out. And yeah, everyone will be able to have a read of it once this podcast is out.
Yes, I think it's fair to say that tensions are pretty high at the moment and to-do lists are pretty long. But by the time you're listening to this, hopefully you'll be able to read the investigation. It was a big effort from our data team as well. So it was a really exciting collaboration across Lighthouse.
And the investigation will be out in El País in Spain and Financial Times. And then we'll have a couple of other rounds of stories coming out afterwards.
I'm going to try to summarize it super quickly, but basically we were the first journalistic organization to be granted access to sensitive Europe-wide labor force data. And with that data, we found that almost half of college-educated migrants are working in jobs beneath their qualification levels. And we were able to quantify the huge economic loss to the European economy due to this structural discrimination. But anyway, it's been a big month for us, but it's been an even bigger month for our US-Mexico border team.
Yes, so they published their first investigation, which exposed why a fire in a migrant detention center in Juarez, Mexico, right on the border of El Paso, Texas, was so deadly.
Lighthouse Reports worked with La Verdad in Ciudad Juarez and Texas El Paso matters to interview survivors, first responders, and officials in both countries and examine 16 hours of CCTV footage, thousands of pages of documents, as well as previously unheard audio.
So it was a visual reconstruction of what happened that night, and it demonstrates how official accounts were misleading. This investigation was published with La Verdad in Mexico and El Paso Matters in the US.
Yeah, this investigation is a really powerful example of how open source intelligence, or OSINT, can be used to uncover the truth and bring justice and answers to victims. So if you haven't watched the video, I'd highly recommend it. It's going to be linked in our show notes.
Yeah, so in this episode, we'll speak about the investigation and how it was received, but we're going to also use this opportunity to dig a bit deeper into what it's like to work in digital investigations and how that can differ from other types of investigative careers.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to this conversation because OSINT is one of the tools that Lighthouse is best known for. It's kind of the bread and butter of actually a lot of public interest reporting because it doesn't involve a huge amount of money or really special access to confidential sources. But a big question for me, and I think a lot of people outside the world of journalism, is, well, if this information is readily available online and accessible to everyone, then I guess why isn't everyone an OSINT reporter and why aren't more people doing it? And how does using that public information form the building blocks of significant and really impactful investigations?
So to answer these questions, we're going to be joined by two of our open source investigators, Jack Sapoch and Monica Camacho, who live in Brooklyn, New York.
They're going to talk to us about what a day in the life of an OSINT reporter looks like, the challenges in the field, and they'll also reflect on the Juarez investigation that was recently published.
And we're also going to be talking to our US-Mexico Border Investigations editor, Melissa Del Bosque, about working with the OSINT team on this investigation and how the story has been received in Mexico.
But before we jump into the conversation, if you have any ideas of who we should be talking to or topics you want us to cover on Backlight, you can always reach out to us at backlight@lighthousereports.com.
So, hi everyone. Thanks for being here. We're a big team today.
Hi, I'm Melissa Del Bosque. I'm the US-Mexico Border Investigations editor, and I'm based in Tucson, Arizona.
Hey, it's Jack Sapoch. I'm an open source investigator at Lighthouse Reports, and I'm based in Brooklyn, New York.
Hi, I'm Monica Camacho, and I am also an open source investigator at Lighthouse, also based in New York.
Thanks so much for making the time, everyone. And firstly, big congratulations on the Juarez fire investigation. The video is such a clear and powerful depiction of exactly what went wrong on the night of the fire. And the visual reconstruction is, I think, such an excellent tool for accountability. And we'll dig into the whole investigation and how you did it in a second. But first, I wanted to take a step back and talk a little bit about your jobs at Lighthouse, Monica and Jack. So you're both open source reporters, or as I think now we say, digital reporters. And whenever you talk about your roles, I'm immediately imagining that you're kind of just sitting at home, stalking people on social media all day. But I know in reality, it's much more than that. So can you guys give me a little bit of a rundown about exactly what your role entails?
It does, like practically speaking, like the way that we use it within Lighthouse reports, it does mean sometimes like stalking on social media in some ways. But we're also using it as a broader term, these like open source investigations to include diverse methodologies like analyzing cell phone, videos, imagery, but also CCTV image or satellite imagery, doing document analysis, or in some cases like reconstructions of events using 3D models like we did in the Juarez fire. So it's quite broad in that way, but I think that, yeah, you're right, that this endpoint for a lot of people into open source investigations or digital forensics investigations, which they're also often referred to, is this sort of like social media stalking. And we were talking the other day about how, there's so much exposure for this Kate Middleton saga, where people were like forensically analyzing images of the royal family for traces of manipulation, or trying to figure out when exactly they were taken or where exactly they were taken. And a lot of ways, that is like the sorts of like techniques or methodologies that we'd use for investigations that are, within the subject matter that we focus on.
And so, Monica, a lot of your specialties involve this kind of quote unquote stalking aspect. Can you talk me through a little bit about how you would find or locate someone online, and also what your other specialties are as well?
So in my day-to-day work, I do a combination of like a few different things. There's person of interest investigations. So that is, more closely related to what we would call like cyber stalking. So looking at people's social media, but also like their public records. Like, have they ever been in any lawsuits? Do they have criminal records? Where have they lived? What phone numbers did they use? And then trying to correlate that to other accounts, like other people, to build out a portrait. I do also a lot of geolocation, linking visual evidence to financial evidence. So like if we can identify brand name, trying to link that to financial or public records. I do things related to technical artifacts and online infrastructure. So if we have a website, looking at the registration information, but also things like what tools were used, what software, what vendors were used in building that website, and can we link those accounts, or can we fingerprint any of them and look for other websites or email addresses and things that might be linked to that website. So, getting into kind of more information security adjacent skills.
So, Jack, I don't know if you remember this, but when we first met, we both started working at Lighthouse around the same time. And you were once like telling me over dinner what you did for fun after work, like after your OSINT fellowship work. And you basically told me that you spent your evenings doing other OSINT work, and you had a bunch of OSINT projects on, which I remember thinking was very impressive. But I realized that I never got to ask you how it was that you first got into this field. So how did you get into it?
Yeah, it's a funny anecdote. I do have a life outside of work. It's sometimes difficult to maintain, but it's an ongoing practice, and one that I think I'm getting better at. Yeah, I mean, how I first got involved in this, field or genre of like investigative research work. I have a background in border violence activism for a number of years. After I finished up my studies, I worked as part of an organization called No Name Kitchen, which works with refugees and migrants along the Balkan route. We started, collecting testimonies from people who had been affected by pushbacks or border violence, on the border between countries like Croatia and Bosnia. But it's, important collecting information about these sorts of things to collect like location data, for example. So from there, like, in the context of interviews, maybe you're asking somebody, well, where you were pushed back, was it close to a river? Did you have a river around you? Were there trees around? How far away was the nearest road or the nearest building, right? And when you're going through interviews with people, you might bring up like Google Earth satellite imagery to do some sort of like live geolocation of the area that they were pushed back. And so I was kind of like using these like open source methodologies because I didn't really realize at the time, so much about this wider field. It was just kind of like a point of necessity. And then in other ways, sometimes people would come back, from these transit attempts, from these pushbacks, and they maybe smuggled their cell phone, like they hid a cell phone with them, and they were able to get 30 seconds of shaky video footage of the guys who apprehended them and pushed them back. So then you have this point of like imagery analysis or verification, geolocation, so on and so forth. So it was kind of like a point of necessity to educate myself in that way about how to do this analysis for this specific subject matter that we were working on. But it's really where I developed my love and passion for the work more fully. And yeah, basically through this work and like conducting these, mini visual investigations on pushbacks, this is how I ended up meeting, other people at Lighthouse Reports who were interested and passionate about the same subject matter. And I guess the rest is history some way.
So it wasn't just through playing GeoGuessr online?
GeoGuessr came later.
That's very cool, Jack. And how about you, Monica? How did you get into the whole OSINT world?
I guess it would go back to 2014. So my family is Mexican, all in Mexico. And, the drug war comes for all of us eventually. A friend of the family disappeared in the state of Michoacan during a flare-up of a turf war. And his mother, just like she moved heaven and earth to try to find him, organized volunteers to search for him, and publicity campaign, like people putting up flyers and ads on local radio and like spreading the word on social media, trying to get like as much media coverage as possible. So with all of that attention, she starts getting all of these tips of varying credibility, like people who claim to have seen him, or like rumors about where he might be, like is he alive, is he dead? And she even hired a private investigator who wasn't very helpful. So she was just kind of on her own with all of this information on top of like everything else she has to deal with. So I started looking into some of these like rumors and tips. And, this was back when people were still using Facebook. So there were like all of these open Facebook groups belonging to cartels and gangs and their supporters. And, exploring that and getting this like really intimate look at a subculture that I wouldn't be able to explore in real life. Yeah, that really opened up my eyes to both a particular mindset and then also just like the possibilities of finding sensitive information that people just like do out in the open. And it got me interested in financial investigations too, like the economy of organized crime. And yeah, it inspired me to go to grad school. And so after that, the rest is history.
So it seems like for you, Monica, it was a really personal motivation. And thanks for sharing that with us. So as we mentioned before, you guys are fresh out of a big investigation that was very digitally focused. It involved combing through hours and hours of CCTV footage and then using that footage and other evidence to visually reconstruct what happened that night of the fire. And it's actually the first investigation we've done with our new US-Mexico border team. So we're also being joined by our investigations editor, Melissa, who led the investigation. So Melissa, can you tell me a little bit about what the investigation found, why you decided to look into the fire in the first place?
Sure. Yeah. So we worked with two independent border outlets on the U.S.-Mexico border, La Verdad and Ciudad Juarez, and then El Paso Matters, which is just across the river in Texas. And we, since this is the first U.S.-Mexico border investigation, Lighthouse really made an effort to go down to the border and meet with border outlets and border journalists and really hear from them what they thought was important and that wasn't getting the coverage that it should be. And what came from that meeting was this idea of looking into this fire at a temporary migrant detention facility in Ciudad Juarez, which happened about a year ago now. And 40 men died. There were 67 men in a locked cell. And they had lit their sleeping mats on fire in protest due to just the really awful conditions in the facility. No potable water, not enough food. They were threatening to deport these people. And, these are families and folks from Latin America who had arrived in Ciudad Juarez with the idea of applying for asylum in the U.S. But in many cases, they were sent back into Mexico. And so it was a very desperate sort of situation. And so when the fire was lit in the cell, they were not let out.
Joel Alexander Leal Peña from Venezuela was one of them. 3 days short of his 21st birthday, he was detained and transferred to a temporary migrant holding facility just meters from the international border. Before the day was over, he would leave the center in a body bag, one of 40 people who died, trapped in a locked cell, suffocated to death in the smoke.
Official account says that it was because the keys were not at the facility when the fire broke out. How does this investigation kind of disprove that account?
Well, and this is really the power of visual investigation. So with this investigation, we got access to 16 hours of CCTV from, within and without the facility, and a huge investigative file. So we were able to look at documents because this is an ongoing investigation. 11 people have been charged, but there's been no trial date set yet or anything. So Monica and Jack were able to go through this footage, and, what they discovered and all the investigative partners discovered was that, this official narrative that even the president of Mexico had announced that the keys were not there at the facility during the fire, and that's why the cell wasn't opened, was actually not true. This was a huge breakthrough and obviously very, very much counter to the official narrative. And, what they also discovered was that, fire extinguishers were either missing or defective, that exits had been intentionally blocked. And a big find was the discovery of some audio on the CCTV footage, which was sort of buried. You had to listen to it. You had to watch the video for a couple minutes before the audio kicked in, so we didn't know it was there. And Jack and Monica could probably expand on that discovery a bit. But with the audio, we have one of the federal immigration agents saying, I've already told them we're not going to open the doors. So that was, really helped fill in the picture of what was happening during those crucial moments when the men were trapped in that cell.
So Jack and Monica, can you guys walk through a little bit what your role was there as open source reporters?
Yeah, this particular investigation involved a lot of confidential information, so it wasn't classically open source in a lot of ways. And that's partially due to the challenges of the information environment where, it's very opaque. The migration detention system is exempted from a lot of public disclosure requirements, and the requirements that are there under the law aren't being met. The National Migration Institute just refuses to cooperate with federal auditors year after year, and there's no consequences. So yeah, there were some challenges then in finding open sources. But I think when we did use open source methods, it just came down to the details, like visual analysis, taking crime scene photos or CCTV and trying to identify people or objects, like identifying the brand of something, and then like what else can we learn about this object, like from the manufacturer's website, or confirming things with public procurement data, media coverage. As another challenge was even using the confidential material. The government isn't necessarily a reliable source, so were mistakes made, or maybe things are inaccurate, but it's not a mistake. So being able to verify things elsewhere was kind of the value of open source for this particular situation.
I think that a big part of like the legwork was figuring out the movement of people or the movement of objects within inside the center. So a big part was this on a really small scale was geolocations inside the building. And in order to do that, we needed to put in a lot of work to, understand the architecture and the layout of the building, where people were going when they left one frame and entered into another frame, for example, or, where the fire extinguishers were or where the keys were moving to, and so on and so forth.
Right. So it sounds like the strength of this investigation was your ability to apply your open source skills to confidential evidence like CCTV. And also, I guess, the combination of these open source methods and the use of more traditional reporting methods like assessing confidential documents and obtaining witness testimonies.
Yes.
And back to the CCTV footage. So there were 16 hours of it, is that right? Across 4 different cameras.
Yeah, 16 hours of footage across 15 different cameras, actually.
So can you just talk me through how you even start to go about analyzing that amount of information?
As Jack said, like even what we were looking at, like where in the building each camera is. So we had we had names for the cameras, but often they were like hallway to office. So trying to figure that out and then comparing to some of the floor plans that were in the case file. Once we knew that, then we were able to identify like which cameras were the most relevant and had the most relevant information. But we identified the cameras that we thought were the most important and identified sort of a couple hours that we thought had the most valuable information. So, the immediate lead up to the fire, during the fire, immediately after the fire, and then identifying important people. And then once we had individuals in mind, sometimes I would have this on in the background, like while I'm eating lunch. And yeah, it's sort of, I don't want to compare it to fiction, like TV or a movie, but it's definitely a strange feeling to be so intimately acquainted with someone else's life.
Yeah. So one of the peculiarities about the CCTV footage that we were working with, we were operating under the assumption, after going through all of this footage, that there wasn't any audio to the CCTV footage. But that wasn't the case, that there were 2 cameras that were recording audio, and they were like these 2 really obscure cameras that were basically facing a wall, or they were 2 like really tiny cameras that were basically, they were facing the ceiling more correctly, because they were meant to like pick up like visitors to the center as they were approaching like the reception desk. And the quirk that really tripped us up is that you needed to let those cameras play back for like 45 seconds or 50 seconds uninterrupted before the audio would start playing. And kind of embarrassingly, this was something that we didn't discover until like 2 months before publication or something like this. But as Melissa was saying before, this ended up being super important for our analysis and our final findings of the investigation. So that is to say, I think that if we needed to have a takeaway away from this, is that you need to constantly, work with the evidence that you have, and you need to be okay to experiment with it and play around with it. It was a complete accident the night that I found like this quirk in the software playback, that you needed to let it play for that long and specifically highlight it in a certain way. But it was definitely a moment of euphoria when I did find it.
Jack, I can feel the excitement in your voice as you're recounting the moment that you found the audio. I think most journalists can relate to that moment where you find key evidence at the last minute. So it's really cool to hear you recount that experience and how it came about.
And Melissa, I just want to ask, so you have a very long career in investigations and you've worked with a lot of different reporters and types of reporters. I'm wondering, what is it like to work with digital reporters or reporters that are digitally focused? And what has been different for you leading an investigation like this one in comparison to others?
I've been working on the U.S.-Mexico border for a very long time, and a lot of the outlets there don't have a lot of resources. And so to get to work with visual investigation or OSINT reporters like Jack and Monica is like a huge luxury, because it just multiplies your investigation ability by 100. I don't know what we would have done with 16 hours of CCTV without them. I think, just listening to Jack and Monica, you get a sense of just the amount of hours and days and months, because this was at least a 6-month long investigation or more that it took to track the movements of the people within the facility and their actions and the keys and everything else.
You're listening to Backlight, Lighthouse Report's monthly deep dive into the elusive world of investigative journalism. If you want to know more about our investigations, you can subscribe to our newsletter on our website, lighthousereports.com. Or if you have suggestions on who we can talk to on this podcast, you can reach out to us at backlight@lighthousereports.com.
Welcome back. We are chatting with Monica, Jack, and Melissa about our first U.S. borders investigation and the digital tools that they used to reconstruct the deadly fire that happened almost 1 year ago in a migrant detention center in Juarez, Mexico. So, Jack and Monica, back to both of you guys. On the 3D modeling, so obviously Lighthouse, we've used 3D modeling a couple of times, especially in our borders investigations. How was it this time? Essentially, how did you guys kind of make use of 3D modeling? How did the reconstruction work and feed into the investigation?
So yeah, I mean, one of the previous big efforts that we did in Lighthouse Reports was this reconstructing the Melilla massacre investigation, which kind of served as a template, I think, for us going in. We kind of wanted to do something similar to what we did there. Luckily, we were able to draw from this huge case file in which there were floor plans of the center, which is like the, golden egg somehow of what you want to have in these sorts of reconstructions is a floor plan to base your building off of. That being said, it was pretty frustrating because we had 2 or 3 different floor plans that were inaccurate in different ways or didn't match up to each other in certain specific ways, and more specifically didn't necessarily match up to certain elements that we could see and kind of measure inside the building using the CCTV footage and visual evidence that we had. These forensic walkthroughs of the center after the fire were very important for us in that way, because they're kind of walkthroughs of the whole center. But seeing there, you would see a building that, that's maybe 3 times the size that it actually was, but 3 times bigger in one of the floor plans that we were given. What was great and what was really important for us was being able to sequence all of this body of visual evidence that we had, this, complex relationship between doors and keys and hallways and where the fire started and where people couldn't get through and where was blocked exits and so on and so forth. It's quite complex. Even for us who are working inside the investigation, we were finding ourselves tripped up by it and, needing to clarify with one another, oh, which door are you referring to, or which blocked exit are you referring to, and so on and so forth. And for the purposes of our investigation, being able to communicate what exactly we're talking to an otherwise uninitiated viewer in a very short amount of time. The 3D model was super useful for that.
Yeah, it's interesting to hear you describe how, I guess, confusing and complex the floor plans are, because as the uninitiated viewer, when I watch the video, you break it down really simply and you really feel like you're inside the building. So I think that's a commitment to the excellent work you guys did breaking down that model and making us feel like as viewers, we're able to simply understand the situation and how the keys get from point A to point B and where they are at each point in time as well.
Having the model to simplify the understanding of where things are, to situate what is happening, that really helped for some of the analysis of trying to understand what is actually happening. During the fire, there's so much smoke that much of camera coverage we do have is completely obscured. So trying to figure out what's happening in the invisible times and places involved a lot of going back and forth with witness testimony, and they really helped inform each other, because just going by the testimony, the witnesses are contradicting each other and the same witness will give different statements over time. So trying to figure out what those inconsistencies are, or maybe their statement doesn't agree with facts that have been confirmed elsewhere. So trying to figure out what is a mistake versus what is intentional, and understanding the timeline. Yeah, just really simplified that analytical process.
Just to clarify that we weren't able to access the center ourselves throughout the investigation. That's a clarification point for another reason why the 3D model was necessary, and like the way that we went about building it is that after the fire happened, basically the center was closed down and shut down. So it was like not an option for us to tour the center ourselves throughout the investigation.
So you guys mentioned that a big part of your job is finding information from these large amounts of publicly available documents. And I know, at least Monica, you're a pro at this because we're working on an investigation together right now where you're doing a lot of that. And it's a big heavy lift. How do you guys make that process more efficient and find reporting lines from all of this information?
In this case, the documents we're referring to are from the case file. So it was confidential rather than open source. And it is in total over 22,000 pages. And they were scanned PDFs. So these had once been hard copies, and being able to take really diligent notes, like it's not sexy, but just having a good note-taking app. I like Obsidian because you can link your notes to each other and then open up like a graph, like a hub and spoke graph to show how they're all linked to each other. So having detailed notes to keep track of stuff. Yeah, and then just a lot of time, a lot of reading.
It's been a few weeks since the investigation's been published, and it's already made a huge splash, I know, around Mexico. There was a lot of secondary coverage. And even a Mexican senator basically said it was a disgrace that Mexico had not provided justice to the victims of the fires, which I think is a huge result already from the investigation. And as I said, it's only been a few weeks. So as Melissa, as someone who's been kind of reporting on the US-Mexico border in depth for the past 2 decades or so, how do you feel the investigation has landed? And importantly, how do you think it's been received by the families of those who were affected by the fire?
One of our goals with this investigation was to provide information to the families of those men who died and the survivors as to what really happened, because what happens over and over again in these terrible tragedies where, so many people die, especially migrants, is that there's a lot of misinformation and disinformation. And what the senator said in Mexico actually was it was a crime perpetrated by the state. So as Monica, mentioned earlier, when she first got started on OSINT investigations, is that, there's a merging of politics and organized crime in Mexico, which they call narcopolitics. And this has created a real opaqueness to how the government functions. Impunity is really rampant. So anything that you can do in an investigation just to show this is what happened, here's the evidence, provides some sort of, I think, relief to people involved.
Yeah, because if I'm not wrong, the video was also translated into Quiche, which is an indigenous Guatemalan language.
Yeah, that is correct. So many of the men who died were indigenous Guatemalans, and just over the years, indigenous Guatemalans have died in disproportionate numbers on the migrant trails north to the US-Mexico border. And so it was important to reach these affected communities with this information so that they can understand how their loved ones died and what happened. So an effort was really made to have, that visual investigation translated into Quiche and then distributed through Facebook pages and social media platforms that speak directly to indigenous communities in Guatemala.
And how has that been received by those communities?
I think it's been received well. I think, there's a lot of anger over the lack of information and the impunity. And, it's been a year since this fire occurred, and there still hasn't been a trial set. There's been some hearings. And Mexico's president, López Obrador, really has made a point, they're in their presidential election right now, of not really mentioning migrant issues in Mexico. And he's made a real effort to really keep that out of the dialogue. during this election season. And it's very much an issue that needs to be addressed. So I think the investigation has helped. It got very, very wide coverage in Mexico. All the major TV outlets, magazines, newspapers have printed the investigation. We had the Mexican senator bring it up. Also, I think the leader of the PRI party demanded that the head of the National Migration Institute be fired. He's one of the people who's been criminally charged in this case, but he's still running the federal migration system. And he's a very close ally to the Mexican president. I think the investigation has sort of helped clarify and hopefully bring to the fore this issue of, migrants being treated so terribly and with such impunity that we're just seeing huge spikes in deaths of people who are migrating on both sides of the border, not just in Mexico, but also in the United States as well.
Yeah, and I think so often those stories are just not told, or as told as numbers and statistics. And I remember, Melissa, in conversations with you and a couple of other people in the team who were talking directly with the indigenous Guatemalan communities, were saying that kind of accessing the information of what happened to their loved ones in their primary language was so important, because it was such an important part of the process of recognizing those people's dignity and being able to grieve properly.
Yeah, absolutely.
One of the things that I wanted to ask you is maybe, Jack and Monica, if you could maybe speak about what you feel are some of the challenges in this field for you that you've come across, and also if you have any advice to people who would be wanting to join this field, what would it be?
I think one of the biggest practical challenges is staying up to date on the different methods and techniques that are constantly emerging, but then also kind of being made irrelevant, and then new ones emerging in our field, right? There's a constant cycle of approaches to inquiry within this open source or digital forensics field that's responding to new technology or changes to social media platforms and so on and so forth. So there's a lot of work that needs to go into making sure that you're staying up to date on these new techniques. But for me, that's also what makes it very exciting. I mean, this is a field that you can teach yourself, how to do a lot of the things that we do. So as far as it goes for advice to people who are interested in developing their own open source or digital forensics skill set, I think that that's what's important to remind yourself, is that, a good majority of the skills and software that we use, you can get for yourself or develop for yourself, so long as you have an internet connection and an okay laptop. And yeah, to be hungry for this knowledge and to acquire the skill sets. I think that's probably one of the most critical criteria for people who excel in this field.
Yeah, off the top of my head, confusion about what OSINT is. There's a lot of low quality content that calls itself OSINT, but it's really just aggregating from social media, or just bots that are reposting things from Telegram channels on Twitter, and they call themselves OSINT. And then that gets mixed into disinformation and the fog of war. We've seen it a lot in Syria, Ukraine, Gaza, any hotspot that's trending, will have these sorts of communities bubbling up. So that's definitely a challenge, and, connects to larger questions of disinformation and how do you verify information, and then how do you present your own findings in a way that is credible. Also, there's sometimes a tendency to see OSINT methods as magic and as a replacement for reporting and having people on the ground, having sources, having contextual knowledge and experience and expertise. And, it's just one element. It's one part of the toolbox, but there's other tools out there. And advice for beginners, like Jack said, there's a lot of us who are self-taught, and people come from different backgrounds, and there isn't one credential that's, it's not like you must have a bachelor's degree in OSINT, with all of these different paths towards OSINT. Often the way people build a professional reputation is by giving back. So when you get to know the community, there's, lots of us who remember what it was like to be a beginner. And, people want to help each other. People love sharing like tools and workspaces, scripts and resources and training materials. And there's just so much out there. If you're, willing to learn and, be appropriately, grateful when someone helps you out. Yeah. So stay curious, learn from the people who came before you, play well with others, and then, wherever you can, like give back. There's a lot of ways to volunteer, take a look at like Trace Labs or Air Wars, Missing Maps. There's just all kinds of organizations that would love to have these skills. And, you're going to learn a lot. You're going to meet people.
Yeah, and thank you all for your time. I know you're all super busy, and it's been a really hectic few months for you guys with this investigation. I hope you get some time to relax and recharge before the next one. But before we let you go, we're just going to ask you all the question that we ask all of our interviewees on Backlight, which is, with journalists facing threats from layoffs to censorship, what's a moment that made you think this is why public interest journalism matters?
Yeah, well, I mean, just because the growing amount of misinformation and disinformation around migration and at borders everywhere globally at this point, and at the same time, we're having a crisis in media where a lot of local outlets have closed down and, national outlets are laying people off. And then, we also have these growing authoritarian movements. I mean, definitely here in the United States, for sure, that now more than ever, we need public interest and accountability journalism. And we need to, work together to just increase our impact. And that needs to be documented, and the impunity needs to be called out. And I think it'll be important, not just for now, but for the future generations as well, that we document this moment and what's happening.
Yeah, I feel like in that way, throughout the course of this investigation that we just finished up and that we were just talking about, this as far as fire investigation, I was struck with this feeling several times that this is why public interest journalism is important. And I really felt that way towards like our media partners that we published with and that we developed the investigation with in El Paso and Juarez. That this investigation, it was really like more than the sum of its parts, in the sense that, yeah, like we provided support for the analysis of the visual evidence that we had and this 3D reconstruction, but it really wouldn't have been possible without these committed local journalists that we worked with. And I think that that's the beauty of collaborations that we do in an organization like Lighthouse Reports, is coming in and being able to augment, what people are already doing in their localities and communities of focus.
Yeah, I think they hit the nail on the head there. There's such a crisis of confidence in public institutions, and, in some ways sort of a reckoning of what has been done poorly in journalism, and, why do some audiences not trust, mainstream media, and, what needs to be done better in order to earn back that trust. So, doing it well, establishing and protecting your credibility, that has to be, key to journalism if it's going to survive.
I learned so much about what you guys do on a day-to-day basis. They're questions that I have every single day. So this podcast clarified a lot, and I hope it clarified a lot for our listeners too.
Thank you, guys. Bye.
Awesome. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening. You can follow us on our social media. Our Twitter account is @LHReports, and we have a Blue Sky account with the same handle. You can also reach out to us on email at backlight@lighthousereports.com. All of these accounts are linked in the show notes.
And you can subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for joining us, everyone.